You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Grown-ups, if there's a child in your life who is interested in, curious about, or fascinated by people and places from history, then my podcast, The Past and the Curious, might just be a hit in your home. From the invention of microscopes to world-traveling dogs to fashions of the 1890s, gold rush ghost towns, and audiences going wild for walking competitions, we've got a little bit of it all. Hosted by children's author and museum educator Mick Sullivan, that's me, the show is fun, funny, engaging, honest, and beloved by kids and parents alike. Find The Past and the Curious at all the usual podcast places.
Love books?
Curious about the publishing industry? Us too.
I'm Jeff O'Neill.
I'm Rebecca Shinsky, and we host the Book Riot podcast.
Every week we talk about what's new in the world of books and reading.
Trends, breaking news, book awards, bestsellers, scandals, you name it.
If you care about what people are reading and how the book world really works,
subscribe to the Book Riot podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. A lot of sheep had to die to earthquake-proof this building.
I'm Jen McMenemy.
And I'm Jenny Williamson. And this is Ancient History Fangirl.
We're back with the final episode in our 7 Wonders of the Ancient World series. It's been a long series, one that frequently seemed to have the same themes on repeat. Colonialism, Alexander the Great. Colonialism, earthquakes, Alexander the Great. I mean, it's been a long season. Now, we've made it to the end. It's time to finally discuss the glorious Temple of Artemis yet again for a third time, but this time it's about the temple.
Yeah, we are really not done talking about the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. And even after this episode, there's a lot Jen had to cut that is going into various Patreon episodes, so get excited.
Yeah, I feel like 2 of our huge episodes this year were the pyramids, which Jenny took. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon was a huge deep dive as well, but I feel like the really big ones that needed multiple episodes were the pyramids, the Hanging Gardens, and the Temple of Artemis.
The Pharaohs was a big one.
Did you do that in 2 parts or just 1?
It was 2 parts, yeah.
I mean, Olympian Zeus could have been longer. I did siphon off all of the Olympic stuff and do its own episode, so it kind of was 2 episodes. But yeah, this one I could easily have done 4 or 5 episodes on. It's just so fascinating. So many people came through the temple. It was in such a central location. But in order to make this really digestible for myself and hopefully for you, our listeners, I kind of had to focus on the theme that I had brought the first time, which was about this worship of this female deity and what that looked like in the ancient times, how that changed, and eventually how we got to building this grand house for what once upon a time was just a little, well, probably not a little, but just a plank of wood.
Yeah, and it's interesting because to me, I think this story really does hit differently after the election. Prior to the election is when we recorded the first one and I believe the second one. We recorded them both at the same time. So it does hit different, and I'm glad to be revisiting it and just getting back in touch with my feminine rage. It's fine.
It's been a long November. I just feel so angry that it's just so necessary because, it's very clear we didn't start this place. Moving on. Let's get back to our girl Artemis.
In our last 2 episodes, we discussed what worship looked like at the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, how the goddess was worshipped, who worshipped her, and what they believed. Now we're going to talk about what the temple looked like, who built it, who burned it to the ground, who rebuilt it, how else it was destroyed, who rebuilt it again, and what people did at the temple besides worship. We're basically going to dig into a little bit more of the physical reality of this temple. It's time to dig into the ground and build back up this temple, stone by stone, with the stories of the people who walked its hallowed halls. As we mentioned in our first episode in this series, Ephesus was an important place in the ancient world. It was at a crossroads between the Western Mediterranean and the East. It was vital for trade across the Mediterranean and beyond. In short, everyone wanted to control the city of Ephesus. Greeks, Persians, Romans, Babylonians, and more. Located in present-day Turkey, the city of Ephesus constantly changed hands and rulers throughout the millennia.
The temple, called the Artemisian, was located on a marshy plain where the river and the sea met. It was built probably to be easily accessible by boat and sea travel, making it possible for pilgrims to approach the sanctuary by water or land. As we mentioned in the first episode, this was unusual for many of the ancient Greek temples. In particular, the ancient Greek ones tended to be at higher elevations, like the Acropolis, which absolutely dominates. It's on this hill above the city of Athens. Knossos is up on a hill. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia. All of these were kind of the Oracle of Delphi, set up high and a little out of the way. But the Artemisian defied this logic. It was built in a place where nature proliferated, where sea and fresh water mingled, a holy place since long before a formal building had been constructed on the site. While the city of Ephesus and the area surrounding it changed hands many times throughout the millennia, one thing was constant: the worship of an ancient goddess, a goddess who became known during the Greco-Roman era as Artemis. However, worship of a goddess at Ephesus predates the first mentions of Artemis.
This is what we know about the original settlement, including the city of Ephesus. This is according to an article on Olympioid.com by Vasiliki Mountzuri, apologies if I said that wrong, titled Ephesus, the Historic Legacy of the Home of the Temple of Artemis. Quote, excavations show that the area surrounding Ephesus has been inhabited since the Neolithic Age, or around 6000 BC. Settlements from the early Bronze Age and Mycenaean Age have also been discovered, indicating an expansion of the area around the 13th century BC. Ephesus, as we know it today, was founded as a Greek colony in the 10th century BC. It quickly became a city dedicated to the Lady of Ephesus, who was identified as Artemis and/or the Anatolian goddess Cybele or Cybele.
And you know what? In Christian times, there's still a Lady of Ephesus. Those of us who know our history, we know that that's Artemis. But in the Christian religion, that's now Mary of Ephesus. It's the Virgin Mother of Jesus. She's still there. She always comes through no matter the religion.
Interesting. So let's break this down. Since at least the 6000s BC, there was a human settlement at Ephesus. Worship of a goddess called Artemis, or even Cybele or Cybele, as we know the goddesses today, can be dated to around the 13th or 10th century BC. That's a really long time. They might have been called something different, like that worship has probably changed and evolved over the centuries. But it is clear that humans have been in this area long before this time, and less formalized worship of some sort of mother goddess predates worship of Artemis or Cybele.
In short, people have been worshiping a mother goddess in Ephesus since before there was a name for this goddess. And, spoiler, they still do. And I find all of this really wild and exciting. But we're not going to talk too much about the people who worshipped here before the temple was built, mostly because we don't know a lot about them. And as we said in the first episode, this area of Ephesus was a liminal space, filled with the most wonderful wildlife, seabirds and landfowl, freshwater fish and dolphins, to say nothing of the predatory beasts and wild deer. In short, Ephesus was located at this merging of land and sea, freshwater and salt, and it made the space feel sacred and holy of not just this world, but the divine. So, there was some form of worship going on in Ephesus pretty much since the area was inhabited by humans. We have evidence of 3 temples existing, or 2 temples, definitely 2 temples existing before the one that was famously set on fire.
So there's 3 temples in total, definitely.
Definitely. It might be evidence of a 4th, but it's a little unclear. I would say 3 temples totally. So before the one that was set on fire, there's definitely 1 temple. No, there was 2 temples. Anyway.
This is hard. I remember us trying to parse this in the last 2 episodes and me trying to figure out which was the temple that got burned down and rebuilt, which one was the one that people were talking about that made the list,
So it's really fascinating. It still is that hard.
That's what the sense I'm getting. Like, we parsed that out a little more precisely in this episode. So I think you're going to come away with knowledge of that, right?
Yeah. So we know for sure there were 3 temples on this site in total that were formalized. Let's call them formalized. They were structures, right? There was the first one, the second one, which is the one that famously burned down and was rebuilt, and the third one. And we know some stuff about the second one because it was written down and documented and because of who built it. Most of the stuff we know, a lot of the really cool things, are from both the second and the third. We know nothing about that first one, except that it existed. Right. So we have evidence of 3 temples existing in total. One that was flooded before the second temple, the one that was famously set on fire and then rebuilt into the temple that was then made famous by the list, the 7 Wonders of the Ancient World list. We don't know much about the first temple, the earliest one. We don't really know what it would have looked like, but we do know a curious detail about it. So remember when I said, and this is true of all of the temples, but in particular, we start with the first one. Remember when I said just a few minutes ago that Ephesus wasn't built high on a hill or in the mountains? As I've said quite a few times, this was a deliberate choice. It was built on a marshy plain so that it was accessible to all sorts of visitors coming from the sea or the river or the land. It was built here also because of the fecundity of the land and wildlife. And the ancient peoples knew that the Artemision was built in an area prone to flooding and also landslides. In fact, we know that the later designs took into account the flooding and raised up the temple so that it wouldn't be prone to damage from flooding as much or potentially landslides.
But one of the earliest versions of this temple was in fact destroyed by a flood in the 600s BC. That's the temple number 1 that we know about. This is what we know about that first temple and its destruction. This is a quote from an article called Temple of Artemis, The Destruction of a Temple on EphesianTourism.com. Quote, "The Temple of Artemis faced its first destruction due to a devastating flood in the 7th century BC. This catastrophic flood caused more than half a meter of sand and debris to be deposited, covering the original clay floor of the temple. Among the remnants discovered within the flood debris were fragments of a carved ivory plaque portraying a griffin and the Tree of Life. These fragments were believed to have originated from northern Syria. Additionally, elliptical cross-sections of drilled tear-shaped amber drops were unearthed. These artifacts were likely part of the adornments on a wooden effigy, a zoanon representing the Lady of Ephesus. It is speculated that the wooden effigy was either destroyed or salvaged during the flood. Despite the temple's vulnerability to flooding and the subsequent rise in silt deposits, which gradually elevated the silt by approximately 2 meters between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, and an additional 2.4 meters between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, the temple continued to be used. This persistence highlights the significant role played by the sacred location in the religious organization and identity of the temple.
Yeah, and I think this is just so fascinating, right, Jenny? Like, this is telling you this area was going to flood again and again, but people were like, no, this is a secret space. We need to stay here regardless.
I also really like the part about the zoanon wooden effigy. Like, is that the plank that we talked about?
Yes.
So, yeah, we talked about Artemis being worshipped in the form of this sacred wooden plank in episodes either 1 or 2 or possibly both of this mini-series on the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. And I was talking about how, a wooden plank sounds like really basic, but if you look at how the ancients decorated and carved these wooden planks, the sugar idol was a wooden plank. That has charisma. And it sounds like this wooden plank was very elaborately decorated with amber, which was very precious stone at that time.
Yes, we're actually going to talk about that a little bit because there's some really fascinating stuff about amber and what the ancients believed about amber. Amber is just, I love amber in general. Like, give me all the amber jewelry. It's gorgeous, right? Like, and it looks so good with my hair. But anyway.
My favorite amber is the amber that has like little bugs in it and stuff. Like, researchers have learned about ant evolution based on dinosaur age ants caught in amber. Isn't that fascinating?
It's one of those things that I'm just like, I'm always drawn to. It also looks very otherworldly. It's got that glow to it, right? So that was the first time that the temple was destroyed. But it wouldn't be the last. The first time the temple was destroyed, it was destroyed by flood. This would not be the last time that the temple was destroyed. The first time it's water, the second time it's fire. And the third time it's Jenny's boyfriend, the Visigoths. It goes flooding, fire, Visigoths. If you wait around long enough, the Visigoths will be back.
That's how I made it through puberty.
Pretty much.
I don't know what that means, but I'm going with it.
Anyway, moving on. So what I found fascinating about researching this wonder was how many times it was destroyed and rebuilt. You would think after the first, 2 or 3 destructions, the ancient people would have decided to rebuild the temple at a different site, but they didn't. This space was so sacred and so intrinsically bound to the DNA of their worship that they couldn't move it. It had to remain here, and it had to be rebuilt and protected each time it was destroyed. That's so fascinating to me. So let's now talk about the temple. I guess we're going to call this Temple 1 the Flood Temple, although the data here is a little unclear if the temple destroyed in the flood was the first temple or maybe the second. I think they conclusively think that there were 3, but I don't know. So what the Flood Temple tells us, it actually tells us a lot about how Artemis was worshipped back in these very ancient times, even if we can't get a clear view of what the temple would have looked like, except that it had a clay floor. So I want to stop for a couple of minutes here and point out a few fascinating things. First, this flood was absolutely devastating. It deposited over 0.5 meter of sand. Second, it tells us a lot about how the original Artemis was worshipped. And in our first episode, we talked a lot about that plank of wood, the God-touched wood, as I started calling it very dramatically. This God-touched wood was the original icon or statue or idol of the goddess. And I didn't get too in the weeds about how she was adorned. I gave you a little bit because I knew I wanted to save some of that talk about the adornment and what the wood wore and later the ebony and other idols for this archaeology episode. So here we go.
So let's talk about the amber.
Yes.
Amber is stunningly beautiful. Even today, it's one of those gems that I just find captivating. I know Jen does. I have a piece of amber that my brother gave me that has all these cool little bugs in it. I love it.
I mean, we're the Jurassic Park generation, right? Like, we are here for the ancientness of what could be in that amber and what it could teach us. We're such nerds. I love it.
Absolutely. But to the ancients, amber also had a lot of meaning and value. I don't know how they felt about bugs in the amber. I think that the bugs in the amber, ones with really good, very clear bugs in it, that is the best amber, but I don't know how they felt. In her book, 7 Wonders of the Ancient World, Bethany Hughes tells us both the mythological and practical reasons why amber was so revered and valued, particularly by the worshippers of Artemis at Ephesus. Quote, believed to be the tears of the granddaughters of the sun god Helios, amber's Greek name, electron, derives from a term meaning beaming sun and gives us our word electricity. Amber can bear a static electric charge, proof in the ancients' minds that the glowing fossilized sap had supernatural properties. It would have been a worthy gift for the goddess of nature and the rapture of the natural world. The incarnation of Artemis, probably in the 7th century BC, around the time the gardens in Babylonia were being cultivated, as she draws these connections, between all these wonders, then evolved from a plank decorated with gold, fine cloth, and jewels into a more anthropomorphic form with lions on her shoulders or flanked by deer. In all her iterations at Ephesus, Artemis's connection to nature in goddess form, was being remembered and imagined.
Yeah, this book is so great because she really does give you that grounding in what was being built when and where and the time period for so much of this. So I was super excited, needed to include this quote because I did not know about amber and that static electricity charge. Did you know that?
I didn't, no.
I can just imagine this plank of wood with these glowing amber beads that could carry an electric charge. This piece of wood would have been adorned in hundreds of amber beads, almost like tiny bees around a hive, all of them glowing and giving off this otherworldly air. It's just wild, right?
Yeah.
Now, we don't know if the original plank of wood or the original statue of Artemis was saved from the flood. We don't know if it was carved into something like the sugar idol. We don't know. I like to think that this piece of wood would have been saved from the flood. I think probably the wood was saved. You know, it's like a photo album that you pull out of a burning building, right? Like that's how much they would feel about this. I can imagine this would be one of those things they wouldn't want to let go, I can imagine they would be holding it above their head. Like, who cares about the adornments? We care about this piece of wood that is our goddess.
Well, I was kind of imagining the, adornment, these amber beads attached to the wood. I guess it would be hard to take them off. They could have fallen off.
I mean, I imagine a lot of them were parts of necklaces and things like that. So they might have sewn onto cloth, sewn onto lots of things that might have degraded over. It's tough to know. I don't know. I have no answer. The good Catholic girl in me is like, I would go back for the wood. that's my goddess, you know.
Jen's Christian monk periodically shows when we discuss religion in the ancient world.
Well, it's how I grew up, and it's what I saw with both of my grandmothers. And I can imagine extrapolating that further backwards, what it would have looked like. I'm not particularly religious anymore.
Bearing in mind that we don't want to put too much of our own modern lens on it, including our own modern understanding of religion.
Sure, but I do think things that were holy and sacred, like this would have been vital to save if they could. Like, we don't know. We know the flood was catastrophic. We know nothing else.
Well, yeah, I would think that's like a basic assumption, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think that's a wrong assumption, but we don't know if they could. We don't know anything. Anyway, I sort of, as I said, think that it probably this time remained, and maybe it formed the basis of the next temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the one that I keep telling you famously burned down.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Hey, Sal.
Hank, what's going on? We haven't worked a case in years.
I just bought my car at Carvana, and it was so easy. Too easy.
Think something's up?
You tell me. They got thousands of options. Found a great car at a great price. And it got delivered the next day.
It sounds like Carvana just makes it easy to buy your car, Hank.
Yeah, you're right. Case closed.
Buy your car today on
Carvana.
Delivery fees may apply.
An all-new season of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Mom Talk has just been blowing up.
Whitney and Jen are on Dancing with the Stars.
Taylor is a bachelorette.
Saying that out loud is crazy. Like, that is huge.
But all the cool opportunities could pull us apart.
It's causing issues in everyone's marriage.
My whole world is falling apart right now. It's chaos.
Watch the Hulu original series, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+ for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
So, let's get to the next incarnation of the Temple of Artemis. This one we know a lot more about. It's the burned one. Now, this temple was rebuilt by a king, a guy called Croesus, who at the time was ruling the city of Ephesus. And Croesus was a fascinating guy, one who I might do a Patreon episode on at some point. I've got a lot of Patreon episodes to do. I'm not going to get too into the weeds about him because he did so many things. The way he died is so dramatic, crying out for the goddess Artemis to save him. But anyway, he was a Lydian king, and he offered to pay out of his own pocket for the reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis.
So the name Croesus became synonymous with wealth and the myth of King Midas and his golden touch. Croesus could afford this, okay? He had fat stacks. Midas is kind of the mythical version of Croesus, I think.
No, he's actually mythically traced back to Croesus's ancestors, and he's the mythical reason why Croesus's people had so much money.
Interesting. Yeah, but that would be a pseudo history. The actual formation of the myth of Midas, I see him as the mythical version of Croesus.
I think it would be even further back, Jenny. I think it'd be Croesus's great-great-great-grandfather. Yeah, I'm saying I don't think it was one person. I think it was more the whole family, the whole country.
We should do a Patreon on this because now I'm really interested. So Croesus is associated with, in mythology and potentially pseudo-history, with the myth of King Midas and the golden touch. We all know that Midas was cursed by Dionysus so that everything he touched was turned to gold. Midas saw this as a gift, at least he asked Dionysus to do this, and Dionysus was like, okay, friend, but this is not going to play out the way that you want it to.
And Dionysus at this point in the story was in Midas's debt for saving one of his friends, a satyr named Silenus, who raised Dionysus. So he was like, I will give to you whatever you want. And so when Midas was like, I want everything I touch to be turned to gold, Dionysus was like, this is a bad idea, but also I'm just here to drink.
So eventually Midas figured out that this was not so much a blessing as a giant horror show, and begged to have this gift removed, and how this happened was a trip to the real river Pactolus, which was a real river. King Midas allegedly washed away his golden curse in the river Pactolus. And this is where a lot of the wealth, the gold of Croesus and his ancestors came from, allegedly. This is the mythological reason for something that was real. In reality, there were gold deposits in that river, and that was Croesus's territory, and it made him and potentially his ancestors, we don't know, we've got to do a deep dive on this, super interesting. Anyway, it made him super, super wealthy. This dude was rich. He was rich enough to finance the reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis. He could afford it. Everyone back up. He's got this.
Yeah, instead of like going to like, I don't know, Mars, he reinvested that money in helping people and giving them back something they really wanted, because maybe we should make this planet better and not go to Mars. Moving on.
I wonder who you're talking about. I side-eye any billionaires here, but this is not, the worst thing you could do with your money, okay? There's probably better things like, I don't know, feeding people, but whatever. I'm not getting into it.
We're not going to get into it, but one of the things that this church did do was take in refugees, which we'll talk about later. So in some ways, it was feeding people.
Wealthy refugees.
Not always. It took in a lot of refugees from smaller conflicts, like there were Spartan and Athenian wars. It took in refugees from like the Melian conflicts and also potentially plague refugees. Athens was having a plague, like lots of different people. If you were granted sanctuary by the goddess, you could come in and they would feed you and give you a space to be.
That is definitely something we need to do a whole separate Patreon episode on.
It's on the list.
Great. Anyhow, Croesus spared no expense in getting the temple back to her former glory. In fact, she surpassed her former glory. According to the article Temple of Artemis, the deconstruction of a temple, the work began in about 550 BC, and this was the result. Quote, the rebuilding project was entrusted to the architect Chersiphron and his son Metagenes. The result was a magnificent marble structure that measured 115 meters in length and 46 meters in width. The temple's most striking feature was its double row of columns, each towering 13 meters high, which is like 39 feet high, encircling the cella, a sacred inner chamber, where the cult image of Artemis was housed. 36 of these columns were adorned with intricate relief carvings, adding to their aesthetic appeal and enhancing the temple's beauty. As part of the reconstruction efforts, a new cult statue carved from ebony was created by the sculptor Endoios. To enhance the religious importance of the temple, a beautiful statue and a small temple-like structure called a naiskos were added. The dedication and expertise of the contributors to this remarkable reconstruction project exemplified their architectural prowess and unwavering devotion, solidifying the temple's reputation as an exceptional Greek sanctuary devoted to the worship of Artemis.
So we need to take a minute to talk about Croesus and the columns. 36 of the columns were intricately carved and decorated, with their decorations all having meaning, and we'll get to that in a little bit. First, as we've said so many times, Croesus was incredibly rich. He was so rich today that he would be a billionaire or an oligarch and in charge of many countries and leading them to chaos.
Nobody voted for this asshole.
We have to take all this out.
I don't know who you're talking about. I'm not talking about anyone in particular, just saying in a theoretical situation that is theoretically happening right now.
I want everyone to know that I literally have no money. There's nothing to sue me for. Anyway, Croesus was one of those ancient guys or modern guys who love to put their name all over everything.
Oh, geez, I'm not surprised by that.
No, who love to just name departments of the government stupid things based on Bitcoin. Anyway, moving on.
This isn't the worst, absolute worst thing he could do with his money, like I said. But you know what? Like, all rich people are, I think, probably could say they're all assholes. Is anyone rich listening to this? You should contribute to our Patreon.
Because I'm poor and slightly assholic, but sometimes nice. Anyway, moving on.
Wealth redistribution. Sign up to our Patreon.
Moving on. Croesus,
We're doing great.
Doing so good. So Croesus,
everything is in a trash fire.
Yeah, can you tell the difference between when we recorded this episode and the other two?
I mean,
like one has this beautiful cold open and this lyrical language, and the other one is just like really interesting about female power. And now it's like, eat the rich.
I think we always wanted to eat the rich. That's always been a, unofficial subtitle of the podcast.
It's true. Anyway, so Croesus dedicated, i.e. paid for, several of these 13 meters high or 42 feet, Jenny, columns. His name is on them saying dedicated by King Croesus, as it would be. And these columns were marble. They were this kind of really pretty icy blue marble. Some of them were gilded. Many of them were, if Croesus dedicated them. And they were intricately carved with different scenes on them. Each column would have cost a fortune. And it was sort of a status thing to have a column at the Temple of Artemis that you got to dedicate yourself. So to have multiple columns dedicated is a real big flex.
I wonder if he offers his sperm to women at dinner parties.
I don't think that's a great idea to do around the goddess Artemis. I think playing down that aspect of you is a good idea because she's not the biggest fan of dudes who whip it out or offer women things they don't want.
No, she's not. And she'll be like, if you bring that in my presence, you need to lop the balls off. Just saying.
Mm-hmm. So, Croesus was so wealthy, he is credited with creating the first gold coins in circulation, which is wild. His wealth not only funded the temple restoration, but it was also what allowed him to take control of Ephesus in the first place. And this is a semi-mythic story that Bettany Hughes tells us in her book, Seven Wonders of the Ancient World. Quote, in 560 BC, as Croesus blazed west to beat down a challenge to his throne from his nephew and half-brother.
Is the nephew and half-brother the same person?
Bettany Hughes didn't tell me, and it's the ancient world. Could be, or it could be two different people. We don't know.
Probably. This is your brother-nephew. Close relation to the uncle dad.
Half-brother, half-nephew. Anyway.
It's a real tangled family tree going on here.
Or it just could be his brother and half-brother. We don't know. Moving on, his nephew and half-brother. Could be two separate people or one person. I can't tell you.
Is it one Batavi warrior? Question mark.
No, that's us. We've been over this. That's us.
One Batavi incest warrior.
We're not incest warriors. Okay. I'm getting back to Bettany because she is a goddess and she has more to tell us. So, continuing the quote, the first city he attacked was Ephesus, the most strategic settlement in the region. Herodotus tells us a story that the people of the town, in desperation, ran a woolen rope from the columns of the temple to their city, high on the Asaluk hill, covering a 7-stade or just under a mile distance. Note the magic number 7 is at play here. So that Artemis's divine protection, the sanctuary she promised, could leach out along that line to keep their homes and their families safe. But quickly, the inescapable reality of the situation dawned on the Ephesians, and they realized that not even the goddess's protection could keep them out of harm's way. Bummer. And I wanted to include this semi-mythic story for two reasons. First, I feel it dovetails really nicely with the story of Dido, who founded the city of Carthage. And I can't help bringing up the story of Dido. The idea of a woolen rope running from the temple through the city to invoke the goddess's protection is clever, and I feel like it's a trope in these ancient semi-mythic founding stories or protection stories.
The story that I remember that is slightly similar to this is Dido, using an ox hide to define the boundary of her kingdom. And I actually, originally when I read that line, I was like, oh, those are actually not really connected. But then I was thinking about it, and I'm doing some research into basically what did the defenses of the city of Rome look like for book 2 of the Enemy of My Dreams duology. And I was reading about the walls. There were the Severan walls and the Aurelian walls, but before that, the earliest form of, boundary marker was this sort of furrowed ditch that was dug, kind of like a plowed ditch. And I believe that this is what Remus jumped over, getting his ass killed by his brother Romulus, who was just way too aggressive about this ditch. I think the point is that I was thinking about how ditches, and I guess you could even say this rope is playing the same role, and potentially the hide of Dido is playing the same role, is both a boundary and a protection layer, both physically and metaphysically, because they could work, as we know from studying Julius Caesar's siege work, as very practical defenses, and they could also be kind of like a mythic boundary between one region and another, like you see that in Stonehenge and other sacred sites, right? So this is a complex rabbit hole, actually. So yes, I endorse the idea that Dido's boundary hide and this magical rope boundary are slightly connected, because that's how they would have seen those things in the ancient world.
The other thing is, right, Dido in the stories is originally from Tyre, which is in the Eastern Mediterranean area. It's further south. But this story, and I don't know when it was attributed to Croesus, might have been later on in the history, linking all of these sort of, as Jenny said, boundary stories together in sort of these pseudo-historical mythology stories. And I just thought it also shows the ingenuity, Dido in particular, and this is true of Romulus and Remus too, actually, But Dido in particular had this message from the gods to leave where she was and to move forward. And she was very, very God-touched until she got to Carthage and founded her city and then met a dude named Aeneas. But that's another story. So, yeah, I really love just being able to mention when people are being clever. I'm just sad Artemis couldn't protect them from Croesus the whole time.
It's a bummer.
Welcome to episode 3, friends. Croesus' invasion tells us a lot about the reality that at this point in time, Ephesus was changing hands a lot, particularly amongst, these were Lydian kings and other people in this area. So this is who was in control, and that this area was still being really hotly fought after. Croesus would eventually have to defend where he was against Cyrus the Great. That's another story that I could not get into. But again, I just want to show you how quickly it could change.
So the story of Croesus here that we're talking about tells us a lot about what was going on in Ephesus, the city and the area around it at the time. And as we said before, this area of the ancient Mediterranean was highly sought after because of its trade, prominent location for trade, and it changed hands many times. It would, in fact, change hands again during Croesus' lifetime. This also tells us the amount of power, money, and influence Croesus had to be able to rock in and take over this city with the army he funded and then rebuild the temple, because dude was loaded.
And he took that money and reinvested that wealth into the people and the temple and maybe even the city he destroyed taking it. But anyway, he reinvested it. So we all know my episodes don't normally get too into the weeds about the construction of ancient buildings because I find it really hard to parse that information and I kind of gloss over it sometimes in not good ways. But the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus deserves a bit of time dwelling on the construction. So here we go. Croesus' temple was a marvel, even if it is not exactly the final wonder that was on Antipater's list. Without Croesus' temple, right, the fire temple, there would have been no rebuilt temple for Antipater or Philo or any of the other writers who documented it to feast their eyes on. Without this temple and without how wonderful and opulent it was, there could be no temple to come afterwards. So Croesus appointed Chersiphron and his son Metagenes from Knossos, Crete, as the chief engineers to oversee the reconstruction. And both of these men were more than up to the task. And they took on this task and decided they were going to make the new temple as nature-proof as they could at this time period. They wanted it to be able to stand up to both flooding and the frequent earthquakes that rocked this area. And as someone who's been to Greece 3 times, of the 3 times I was there, twice there was an earthquake. As I said, the ancients chose this site according to Pliny in his natural history, and Pliny gets a lot of stuff wrong, including this quote, but Pliny tells us that they chose this site because, quote, a marshy soil was selected for its site, in order that it might not suffer from earthquakes or the chasms which they produce. On the other hand, again, that the foundations of so vast a pile might not have to rest upon a loose and shifting bed. Layers of trodden charcoal were placed beneath, with fleeces covered with wool upon the top of them. The entire length of the temple is 425 feet and a breadth of 225. So I came across this really excellent article by Amelia Carolina Sparavina. This article is called Chersiphron and Son Engineers, and it gets a little bit in the weeds, but it also talks about how this temple was constructed. It breaks down what some of these ancient sources might have meant when discussing how the temple was built and what that process was like. And as the article points out, Pliny really missed the point because this temple was being rebuilt on sacred ground. The rebuilt temple wasn't just built on some random place because it might be earthquake resistant. It was built on an ancient holy site, which again, I love Pliny so much. He's like, they thought it was for this reason.
So, this is from the article Chersiphron and Son Engineers. Quote, another problem of marshy lands can be the phenomenon of soil liquefaction. The soil, saturated by water, loses its strength during the earthquake shaking and behaves like a liquid. The Latin naturalist describes that the architects obtained the consolidation of soil necessary to have a proper basement for the temple using some trodden charcoal. It would be interesting to check the mechanical properties of such a substrate with respect to the seismic waves and soil liquefaction. Pliny is also telling us that a layer of fleeces was used to cover the substrate of charcoal. We can try to guess a reason for the use of these fleeces. Probably the architects ordered to prepare this layer to have a sort of seismic isolation of the temple from the ground, allowing it to float on the soil during the earthquakes as a boat on water. That is, this is more or less the same behavior of a modern anti-seismic building. The trodden charcoal and the fleeces seismically separate the building from the liquefied soil, enabling it to float on such soil as opposed to sinking.
Yeah, and the next bit of this quote talks about how they raised the building up, and that is the sandbag thing. So they were raising it up so that hopefully it would stand a better chance of not being so decimated should there be an earthquake. That's what that was about. It's interesting to know that, like, that is still what we're doing today, like a version of that. Like, even back then, that was the most effective way to handle this problem. And today we're like, yeah, the old ways work. Not exactly the same, obviously.
So the article continues later on to say, quote, the anti-seismic technology consists of installation of some isolators which decouple the buildings from the ground. Such isolators are cylinders consisting of alternate layers of rubber and steel bonded together with a central lead core. The rubber layers allow the isolator to displace sideways because they are very soft. However, the structure is very stiff vertically because the layers of rubber are reinforced by steel. These two characteristics allow the isolator to move laterally and, at the same time, they can carry significant axial load. The lead core acts as a damper of oscillations. Pliny continues his description, quote, Chersiphron was the architect who presided over the work. The great marvel in this building is how such ponderous architraves, I don't know what that is, could possibly have been raised to so great a height. This, however, the architect effected by means of bags filled with sand, which he piled up upon an inclined plane until they reached beyond the capitals of the columns. Then, as he gradually emptied the lower bags, the architraves insensibly settled in the places assigned them. In building the temple, people used the inclined planes to enable an easy work against gravity of huge masses. It is remarkable the use of bags filled with sand to set the huge stones. It is highly probable that ancient Egyptians had developed several techniques based on the use of sand to put stones and obelisks in their proper positions, and that this technology had migrated within the Mediterranean region. The temple built by Chersiphron and Metagenes was destroyed by fire on 356 BC.
So I think what it's saying here, Jenny, is imagine a column, right? Imagine putting this column into essentially a hole, right? And in order, when they're raising the column up, like when they're building it and getting it in place, they need these sandbags to keep it steady. And then once it's in place, they remove those sandbags and it should stay in that hole. And it might move a little bit because that's the technology, right? That it can move a little bit and withhold the force of an earthquake. I mean,
I see this as like a way of setting up the columns, but I'm confused as how that relates to the previous paragraph about earthquakes.
So what I'm getting from this is that there's kind of like this, and I could be wrong, there's some wiggle room by the way these columns were set down that should allow them the ability to sort of like move if they have to when the earth moves and not break. But I could be wrong.
Like they're supporting struts and columns that are like both flexible and strong.
What it seems to be explaining about the modern seismic technology is that it allows the building to take some of the weight and move in one direction or maybe the other. Seems like something to do with this sand and the way they use this sand to then, I guess, maybe drain into wherever the columns were going into. And once they were in place, acted in a similar way, but I could be wrong. I honestly could be wrong. So that's what I got from it. But even if that's not correct, what there is in here somewhere was that the ancients were using a form of earthquake proofing this building. And that even in modern times, we're still doing stuff like that. And I'm always obsessed with earthquakes. And to see that even back in the BCs, humanity was dealing with how to build something that hopefully could withstand the wrath of the Earthshaker, who is Poseidon, in case you're wondering, that just blows my mind.
What blows my mind is that they could seismically isolate a building from liquefied soil underneath it using sheepskins on the floor. Like, that is baffling to me.
I mean, I think Amelia is saying that is the evidence we found, is that's what they were doing. Like, Pliny was onto something there.
That and a charcoal substrate. Like, I'm just like, you can do that just with a charcoal substrate and some sheepskins? Are you kidding me? I need to know more.
I don't think it was just some sheepskins, right? I think there was a lot of sheepskins.
A lot of sheep had to die to earthquake-proof this building.
Well, let's be honest, they would have anyway, because this is Artemis's temple. So I just found it so fascinating that this is similar to stuff we're doing in modern times. I was just done. I was like trying not to text Jenny at 5 a.m. when I found this. Anyway, That was how the building was constructed from the literal ground up. But what about the rest of it? Now, Jenny, we're going to return to those columns because the columns, the altar decorations, everything about this temple was making a statement. One about feminine power, feminine rage, and feminine authority. For more on that, we have to go back to our goddess Bethany Hughes. So remember when in our first 2 episodes we talked about the mythology of the Artemisian and how it was said to have been founded by the Amazons? Well, would it surprise you that the columns were carved with intricate portrayals of the Amazon stories? It really shouldn't. Would it shock you that Amazons were on display inside the temple as statues? No, we know that. Nero took one. Anyway, these columns were magnificent works of art. They were carved in this really fascinating blue-white marble that I think was local to the area. And they were carved by the greatest artisans of their day. And the thing about Ephesus that makes it even more interesting to modern scholars is what we found there.
So Bethany Hughes tells us about the hoard of treasures that have been uncovered at Ephesus and how many of them link back to feminine iconography and symbols of fertility. Quote, "Indeed, in the archaic period, no other sanctuary boasts the wealth of gold found at Ephesus' Artemision. There is jewelry, predominantly women's, probably donated by female visitors, earrings in the shape of boats, mini goddess pendants, floral-headed pins, brooches like birds of prey. It sounds like Jen's Wonderland."
Yeah, it sounds like if I could have all of these things in my jewelry box, what a jewelry box I'd have.
Also discovered were electrum coins, an embossed golden falcon, drilled amber, fragments of ivory perfume jars. These are fertility symbols, currently held by the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, protected behind its shady gardens where kittens and cats play happily in the courtyard. I love that detail.
I had to keep that in. I couldn't cut it out.
Perfect. It's perfect. In the Ephesus Museum, the gold on display from the site is breathtaking, with delicate bracelets, ornamental pins, and finely decorated bands. And commanding the whole room, there are those tiny, captivating, enigmatically smiling gold female figurines, perfectly formed, just 3 inches high, their arms neatly beside their sides, waists cinched, one with a dimple in her chin. These offerings to Artemis have enormous charm. All the gold at Ephesus is of exceptional purity, much straight from Sardis. Interior columns of the temple itself were gilded with silver and gold. We're still on Croesus' temple. We haven't even gotten to the temple that made it to the 7 Wonders list.
We're still here at Croesus' temple, as far as I know, if I haven't confused something, which I don't think I have. And I just wanted to stop here for a minute because this tells us so much about the people who came to the temple. It tells us what they valued, what they offered to the goddess, and how well cared for these items were. All of these offerings were of the highest quality, meaning they were donated by probably very wealthy people, or they were family treasures passed down through the ages, through the generations, brought before the goddess in a desperate plea for help, intervention, or guidance. The fact that so much of it remains tells us how great the treasury at Ephesus was, how revered this version of Artemis was by both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western, and how safe the people felt this temple was. One of the things that I learned while researching this episode is that these ancient temples, as well as being places of religious worship and sanctuary, were also treasuries. They were places where kings and queens would deposit their wealth because they believed that no one would rob from a god or goddess. I mean, this clearly wasn't the case. We know people broke into the Great Pyramid of Giza within 100 years of it being constructed?
Well, we don't know when people broke into the Pyramid at Giza first. That's actually one of the mysteries, but one of the theories is that it was broken into relatively soon after being built.
Yes. So, much like the Pyramid of Giza's robbery, it wasn't the case. There were quite a few attempts to rob the Temple of Artemis, and that is also another rabbit hole I couldn't go down because this episode is quite long already. So now let's move inside the temple. Bethany Hughes tells us about the epic sacrificial altar, which was surrounded by its own colonnades, its own marble columns. Many of these columns inside the temple were donated by prominent kings. Quote, "The temple's sacrificial altar in front of the entrance was surrounded by its own colonnade, with stalls for the waiting tribute animals. It was all part of a complex that had become grander and more audacious than any other temple ever seen in the Eastern Mediterranean." And Jenny, some of those animals, particularly the ones that Croesus dedicated, had gilded tusks and horns and everything else.
I thought you were going to say that some of them had gilded nipples.
He might have gilded their nipples. I mean, I haven't done a deep dive in did they gild their nipples.
I just need to know who did and did not have gilded nipples in the ancient world. That's just what I need to know. And which among the monoliths had dicks. So, in short, the inside of the temple was as grand as the outside. The inside of Croesus' temple. This isn't even the temple that made it on the Seven Wonders list. This is a previous temple. Just keep having to repeat that so we all make sure we're grounded in time here. And at this point in time, the lone piece of wood that started its life as the statue of Artemis that pilgrims and priests worshipped changed. So there was an ebony statue that was very elaborately crafted, but we don't know what it looked like because it hasn't survived. And I don't think any depictions of it have survived. And the plank of wood, we don't know if the plank of wood got washed away in the flood or if it was saved and was still there and was used as a cult object along with the ebony statue or if the ebony statue replaced it.
We know at this point in time, a cult image of Artemis in ebony was created. Could it have been the one with the many boobs? Maybe. We don't know what happened to this original statue. And I also don't know whether or not this replaced the plank of wood, because in theory, if that plank of wood was still there, it wouldn't have. Or if there was one version of the statue that was outside, and maybe the ebony one, and the wood was inside, or vice versa. I can't give you that answer.
In case you are like me and you need to sort this stuff out with your brain.
I just think we don't have the answer for whether they were still worshiping the original sort of plank of wood or if that, as I've said, was actually carved into something else. And the ebony statue, if it is the many emboobined one of Artemis, parts of that are ebony. We don't know if that's the case here. We just know there was an ebony statue.
Yes, and we also know that it was bigger than the plank of wood, and it had a special outdoor open-air altar that allowed this big statue to be worshipped. We know those things, and that is basically it.
Pretty much.
Did you know only 6% of people are getting enough fiber? That's why Quaker created Fiber February, a month-long movement to show your gut a little more love. It's like dry January, only easier and more delicious. Quaker has over 100 delicious options that are a good source of fiber. So go buy Quaker Oats today and join the Fiber February movement for a healthy gut.
Raise the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an Enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. Start converting your B2B audience today. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started today at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey, I'm Jeff O'Neill.
And I'm Rebecca Shinsky. And together, we host the Book Riot Podcast.
It's a weekly show about books, the publishing industry, and the readers who make it all happen.
We cover major book news, publishing trends, bestsellers, technology, and yes, the occasional scandal.
Want to know whether that buzzy new book is actually good? We've got you.
Plus, award winners, book talk controversies, the It Books of the Month, and interviews with interesting people from around the world of books and reading.
Basically, if it's bookish, we're going to talk about it.
If you love books and you want a deeper look at how the publishing industry works,
check out the Book Riot Podcast.
Find it wherever you get your shows.
And I wanted to just pause and talk for a minute about one more aspect of this incarnation of the Temple of Artemis. In addition to the blue-white columns being intricately carved and probably decorated with scenes from the Amazons, the eastern pediment of the temple had the protection of a very familiar friend of the podcast, a gorgon. Gorgons, all thought to be female, were fierce, quote-unquote, monsters. We talked about the most famous one, Medusa, in our book, Women of Myth, which is out now, makes a great Christmas present. Gorgons were feared by men and believed to be protectors of homes, animals, and of course, women. So here's what Bettany Hughes tells us about this particular gorgon. Quote, a gorgon's head, we are told, was raised to the front face of Artemisian's eastern pediment. Gorgons were originally a decorative feature from the Near East, a nightmarish incarnation of our fear of the ferocity of the natural world and society's fear of women. Another gorgon from exactly the same date survives and still glowers down from within Corfu's archaeological museum. Its fearsome stare and head curling with snakes shocks even today. The Artemisian temple showed this Eastern-leaning influence throughout. the elegant Ionic order. Ionia loosely spanned the Cyclades and the Aegean Sea and the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, which adapted floral patterns and decorations from Eastern art. The fact that human figures were used within the temple architecture itself. Think of all those beautiful women described in the decorations of public buildings in Babylonia and the regal figures in Egypt, and that dreadful serpent-haired monster. We misidentify this wonder if we describe it as Greek. The Temple of Artemis was an oriental, monumental home for the Asiatic goddess, the deity appearing in the form of a cult statue, built in local marble, but drawing inspiration from a wide Eastern Mediterranean radius. And again, I wanted to include this because it tells us a lot about the influences of the Eastern and Western Mediterranean cultures. It gives us that basis for, was this originally a cult to Cybele, to Sybil? And did that change over time to Artemis for reasons? It also tells us about these Gorgons, and Gorgons are fascinating to me because they were feared. They were wild, chaotic, turn you to stone, devour your soul female creatures. And, you just didn't fuck with them unless you went into their lair and tried to cut their head off. But most of the time you died unless you were fucking Perseus.
You can't get away from images of male colonization of women in ancient Greece because even the strong women are being colonized by men, and that's the only story they know how to tell.
Well, yeah, of course. Perseus and Theseus here are shown as Perseus triumphing over the female Gorgon, the female monster. Theseus triumphs over the Amazons because, again, if we show these images of women, we have to show that there is a man who can subdue, tame, or destroy them and put them back in their order. And that makes me so sad because that is also present here at the Temple of Artemis. At Artemis's temple, this Gorgon was a warning to everyone who crossed the threshold that this was a place of feminine power. The same with the Amazons being here, right? The power of this goddess, Artemis, who was a lot like those Gorgons, she did not take any male shit. She killed men for seeing her or her nymphs bathing.
She made her priests castrate themselves to come into her presence.
Absolutely. And I just love that this big fuck you sign greeted everyone who came to the temple. It was not at all a subtle warning. Behave or our girl Artemis is going to get you.
So all of this is what the temple would have looked like during Croesus's reconstruction. So again, we are still at the Croesus's reconstruction stage. This is the second temple that we're aware of. Croesus didn't get to live to see this temple finished, and he would have been very bummed to hear what happened to it in 356 BC, so it was only around for like 200 years approximately. In 356 BC, the temple was destroyed a second time, and we've talked about this in our previous episodes on the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. This time it was a deliberate act of arson. Who set the fire? Well, that is actually up to some debate. The story goes that an enslaved man named Herostratus set the fire. Again, we've talked about this before in the other previous episodes. He was trying to protest something, and it is very unclear what. The act of arson and destruction was so heinous that essentially the people of Ephesus tried to make him a damnatio memoriae. They wanted his name and his existence stricken from the record. You were forbidden to mention him or say his name in connection to the fire. Of course, this had the opposite effect, and everyone remembered his name and that he set the fire. If you know anything about damnatio memoriae, it's a great way to get famous. I've seen it said in some places that he set the fire to be remembered and to be infamous. Jen doesn't buy that. I don't know that I buy that, because here's the thing. Herostratus' confession was elicited via torture. We talked about that before. I have done extensive research on the rack in the ancient Greece. That's the kind of person I am. I believe he was racked, right?
I believe he was, yeah. And again, confessions elicited under torture, like now we wouldn't, as modern people accept them, right? So like...
Nobody's forgotten about Paulus the Chain.
Exactly. So it's like, was it real or was it just to make the pain stop? I don't know.
Exactly. I don't think the confessions elicited under torture are admissible in a court of law these days, nor should they be. Anyway, so there are some modern historians who have a slightly different take on what happened with this whole Herostratus fire situation. So this is a quote from the article, Temple of Artemis, A Destruction of a Temple. Quote, however, some modern scholars have raised questions about Herostratus' involvement. They point out that gaining access to the roof framing would have been difficult, as I guess the fire started in the roof? ? And they suggest the possibility that the temple administrators, aware of the structural issues the temple faced, may have secretly initiated the fire. The conservation of the original sacred location, despite subsequent rebuildings and the challenges posed by flooding and foundation stability, have also been a subject of interest. The motive behind Herostratus' actions is a matter of debate. It is important to note that Herostratus' confession was obtained under torture, raising questions about his motivation's veracity. Some scholars argue that Herostratus may have been a useful idiot manipulated by the temple priesthood for their own purposes. So that's my question, Jen, is why would the temple priests and administrators want to set their own temple on fire or manipulate Herostratus to do it for them?
So a couple of reasons. I saw in a couple of places that the temple needed a bit of a facelift. It needed some work done to it. And maybe at this point in time, they couldn't find anyone who would do it. Very auspicious date we're going to talk about. I mean, this theory could also be quite apocryphal because the date that the fire burns down is also the date that Alexander the Great is born.
So basically what you're saying is they were trying to find a Croesus. And a Croesus will sweep in and restore the temple after something extremely dramatic has happened, like a flood or a fire, but he won't sweep in and just give it a minor facelift, absent some kind of a dramatic situation.
I suspect it wasn't a minor facelift. Like, they did say it had structural problems. I don't know. I didn't do a deep dive into, like, had there been a bunch of earthquakes or other things that might have damaged it, that it did need this work. And at this point in time, we're talking about, this is right around the time of Alexander the Great's birth. So there was a lot of wars and other things that were happening that probably meant people were not so concerned about giving money to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, right? This is a way to, like, get people's attention again and make them remember how important it was. In this theory, it's also like, you know, I've been to Greece at the end of the summer and I've seen the wildfires. It's very dry in this area of the Mediterranean too.
Absolutely. I mean, it could have been accidental.
I also think, like, how bad was the damage? Because most of this temple was made of stone. So it would have charred and blackened, but it would have had to been really hot to completely destroy it. I'm assuming the roof would have had some kind of thatch or something on it.
Or probably like wooden struts.
Yeah, and that's why you would have started it there, and then everything would have crashed down, and you probably would have had a lot of loss of life and stuff like that. But I don't have the answer here, and I don't think we know why. And, you know, why was the fire set? Could it have been to find a whale to rebuild the temple and fix all the structural problems?
Attract a Croesus, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, that also seems suspect. Like, that's quite a big leap, right?
Seems like cutting off your nose to spite your face to me.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. This is something I only saw in one article. It wasn't something that I saw Bettany Hughes putting forward. I've seen some of the sources say that this is the point that the original statue of Artemis, the block of wood, would have been lost. It would have been lost in this fire if it still existed post-flood. So if the fire was set by these temple administrators, wouldn't they have tried to save that beloved idol? Like, you know, wouldn't you have gone back for it? I don't know what to make of any of it. And all I know is that, I believe it's July 20th, 356 BC, the same day that Alexander the Great was born, the temple burned to the ground. Croesus' temple burnt to the ground. The story about the temple being burned on the day that Alexander was born went a long way into his myth-making and into maybe ensnaring him as a whale later on.
Clever. I love this ancient world scamming shit. This delights me. A lot of scamming was done by priests trying to get funding for their temples.
Exactly. Although there is some reasons they say certain things. But anyway, this was the tale that was told to make that boy king, Alexander the Great, seem more divine. And it was another way that we see Alexander the Great tied to the Seven Wonders, which is wild. So after Herostratus maybe burned the temple to the ground, the people of Ephesus were determined to rebuild the temple even bigger and better than before. And their plan would require a lot of money and a lot of talented artists.
So this new third, possibly fourth, but probably third, temple took about 120 to 150 years to complete. Some very famous people offered to pay for the reconstruction, so that scheme to attract a whale apparently worked.
They were trying to fundraise for decades, and when Alexander came through on his conquest, they were like, God, King, boy, King, could you take a look at our ruined temple?
It burned down the day you were born. You're connected to it.
You, the great light of this world, you're coming into this world. Did it have a divine spark that burnt our temple? I mean, I can see the narrative they're trying to create here.
So anyway, the people of Ephesus, they decided not to allow white whale Alexander to pay for their temple because they felt it wasn't right for a god to pay for the building of another god's temple. Okay, at least that's how the story goes.
I totally do not believe that in any way, shape, or form. think it's like, yeah, put it down on the record that this was an anonymous donation, because we wouldn't want, one god to see that another god is doing that. We wouldn't want that. It would not look right.
Right. How could we take the money of one god to restore the temple of another god?
It's so apocryphal to me. It feels so much like something somebody just put in there, or it was something that the Ephesians were saying to him to try to get him not to destroy and sack their city any worse than it already was,
Oh my God. It's ancient world scams and it delights me. It delights me to the core. I might do an episode at some point about ancient world scams.
Will you invite our scam daddy Mausolus to come back on?
Oh my God, yeah, of course. He has to tell me all about it.
Saroon, he's always rolling around back there trying to get my attention.
We have a busy podcast. A lot of people are clamoring to get onto the show. For some reason.
Some of them dead.
So, according to EphesusTurkey.com, quote, the new temple of Artemis, the third one, was a massive structure covering an area of 6,000 square meters, which is, I had to put this in, 18,000 square feet. It's like the size of a fucking giant mall or something. It measured 105 meters by 35 meters and was 25 meters in height. That is 315 by 165 feet and 75 feet high. And it was the first sanctuary made of marble. Alexander extended the Temenos, which I think is the land grant around the temple, to make the inhabited area surrounding the temple part of the sacred compound.
He made a national park. Isn't that great? Probably still not a good dude, but he made a national park. Cheers.
Cheers. Listen, morally gray heroes who make national parks, I'm down. Also, a dictator. Not cool. The democracies weren't great either.
I think we definitely have more rights than Athenian women, so that is progress, at least this year.
And that's being rolled back real quick. Anyhow, 127 Ionic columns supported the structure. 36 of these were decorated with reliefs. The facade was adorned with 4 bronze statues of Amazons. So those 36 columns we've seen mentioned were also gilded in gold. Those columns were blinged out. And they were all most likely dedicated by kings, white whales, and various wealthy patrons to 1, show off, and 2, whip their dicks out, and 3, gain the goddess's favor. The entire temple was 4 times the size of the Pantheon in Athens, and it was built before the Pantheon in Athens, so it inspired the Pantheon in Athens. And we just cannot get over the size and scale of this temple. It was so massive, although these numbers kind of remind me of numbers you find in Herodotus about how the walls of Babylon were 1 million feet long or whatever.
Yeah, and these 36 columns, I'm like, didn't we just do that with Croesus? So I don't know. I think there's some funny stuff going on. But
Anyhow, so we are finally at the temple of Artemis at Ephesus that made it onto the list of 7 wonders. So this third iteration of the temple was by far the grandest. You thought you couldn't top Croesus, but oh, you could if you're Alexander the Great. And it was also the temple that we know the most about. This is from the article Temple of Artemis, a deconstruction of a temple. Quote, the third iteration of the temple surpassed its predecessor in size and grandeur. It measured an impressive 137 meters or 450 feet in length, 69 meters or 225 feet in width, and stood 18 meters or 60 feet tall. This is a significantly different set of figures than the one we got that was 18,000 feet. The temple featured a remarkable number of over 127 columns. According to Athenagoras of Athens, the renowned sculptor Endoius, who was a pupil of Daedalus, who was mythical.
I'm sure this Daedalus was named after the mythical Daedalus because he's obviously either that was his name or they gave it to him as an honorific for being quite a good engineer or artisan,
Gotcha. Okay, so not the mythical Daedalus, a real guy, was credited with creating the primary cult image of Artemis. And that would have been, I think, Our Lady of the Many Tits, right? Our many-titted goddess.
I think so, too. I think it's our many be-titted goddess, betitted.
Right. It is tough to know when the be-titted Artemis arrived. We don't know how old that image is. We know how, old specific statues are, but we don't know how old that, iconic image is specifically and when it started to appear.
Yeah, we know that they're copies of an image that would have been at Ephesus. We found some of them at Ephesus, but we don't know where the original came from. And we think that the copies we found would have worked as you go to Paris and buy yourself, a souvenir of the Eiffel Tower in varying degrees of whether or not it's a good copy, a good replica or not. That's what we're talking about with all these little bee-titted statues we found.
We've also found large statues that were probably cult objects. And those are also copies, right?
Yes.
So It is tough to know when the betitled Artemis arrived on the scene. It could be at this time, around when this third iteration of the temple was built. Within the temple was an additional image and altar dedicated to Artemis Protothronia, also known as Artemis of the First Seat. Above this altar, a gallery showcased various images, including an ancient sculpture of Nyx, the primordial goddess of night. So this sculpture would have been crafted by the sculptor Rhoecus in the 6th century BC, so this would have been older than the temple itself, perhaps as old as the first temple. The temple was further adorned with magnificent paintings, columns embellished with gold and silver leaf, and exquisite religious works by renowned Greek sculptors like Polyclitus, Phidias, Cresselis, and Phradmon.
So this article left out my girl, Timarete. She was one of the artists who contributed to the paintings displayed in the temple. Timarete was one of the few female painters that we know of from this time period. She was the daughter of Mycon, the younger of Athens, who was also a famous painter. Timarete was said by Pliny the Elder to have, quote, scorned the duties of women and practiced her father's art.
Hell yes.
That is the exact reaction I think Artemis would have had. She would have been a big fan of Timarete's. So Timarete was going to Timarete and live her best life, and she was going to paint because she was good at it. Her painting of Artemis was kept in the temple, and then it was later moved into the city of Ephesus itself before being lost to history. And I really want to do a mini-sode on her if I can get enough information. What we know of her painting is that there's a copy of it that I think that was done during medieval times, but it's a very odd copy. It's someone painting a copy of the painting. We don't know, we can't see it, and that painting is a naked Artemis. It's very fascinating.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, I mean, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws, I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
So here's the point in the episode where we stop for a minute and we get a recap of what the ancient writers, because ancient writers saw this wonder, right? We want to know what they thought of this temple in their own words. And this is what some ancient writers tell us about the new temple, most likely the third temple, the temple that made their list.
Bearing in mind that the whole point of the list of 7 wonders was it's something you could read instead of traveling there, as Philo specifically says, because he thinks if you travel there to all the wonders, you'll die. I don't know if they all saw these wonders.
But these ancient writers who we're quoting, in theory, saw these wonders. That was the thing they did.
I think that's a real questionable statement.
I don't know. I think Pliny definitely saw. He definitely saw Ephesus. Pliny saw Ephesus. He was in the army and he was all over the Mediterranean. I imagine Pliny saw it. I can't vouch for anyone else. But, I think Pliny, my dude, did.
I think Philo probably didn't see most of the wonders that he writes about. I think nobody saw the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is my guess. Anyhow, let's move on. So, Antipater of Sidon, creator of the Seven Wonders list, or at least his list is I believe, the earliest one. I believe Herodotus wrote a list. I don't know that it's still around. Anyway, he said, quote, I have set eyes on the wall of lofty Babylon on which is a road for chariots, and the statue of Zeus by the Alpheus, and the hanging gardens, and the colossus of the sun, and the huge labor of the high pyramids, and the vast tombs of Mausolus. But when I saw the house of Artemis that mounted to the clouds, these other marvels lost their brilliancy, and I said, lo, apart from Olympus, the sun never looked on anything so grand.
Thanks, Antipater. I'm really thrilled that you also loved our girl's house. So, this is what Philo of Byzantium said, quote, I have seen the walls and hanging gardens of ancient Babylon, the statue of Olympian Zeus, the colossus of Rhodes, the mighty work of the high pyramids and the tomb of Mausolus. But when I saw the temple at Ephesus rising to the clouds, all these other wonders were put in the shade.
Does kind of seem like Philo directly lifted and very minorly reworded Antipater's description, or the translation is just slightly different, but it's the exact same passage. Questionable. I also want to say that I remember seeing these descriptions when I was doing that initial episode about the list of wonders, about how the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was in the clouds, rising to the clouds. Like, those are the two phrases. And I thought it was I imagine this temple on a giant hill, which it explicitly isn't.
Me too. No, explicitly it's not. So you have to think of the illusion that they created to make these people think the temple was rising up when it wasn't. Like, how high did they lift it? How did they lift it? And how did they create that illusion when you came to see the temple? Remember, there was quite a few ways you could approach this temple. You could approach by land, by sea, and by river.
So there would have been an illusion of height. I mean, not an illusion of height, because it was apparently was a tall temple anyway. But they also would have lifted it I guess they would have lifted the building somehow to protect it from earthquakes. And there was this illusion of height being presented in certain ways. And a lot of ancient buildings are like this, considering what it looks like to approach this building from various angles and the effect they want to have.
Absolutely. And also it tells us something about that landscape too, like what the landscape would have looked like. Maybe do you remember when we were in Corfu and we went to that town that was this beautiful abandoned town?
Paleocora, yeah.
Paleocora, people were starting to come back to. When you watch the way the clouds rolled down the mountains, it gave you such an optical illusion of feeling like you were low to the ground. You were actually quite high up. So I don't know how this valley would have looked when the clouds came in. I don't know how they approached it, that this is the feeling they have of it reaching up like that.
So, who wants to hear about what Pliny the Elder has to say?
Oh, I love that silly dude.
You and Elodie Harper have the deepest affection for Pliny the Elder.
I treat him like an uncle you dote on here. That's wrong, but I don't think it's wrong because you're curious and you're not actively being the worst, so it's okay.
Anyway, Pliny the Elder, quote, the great marvel in this building is how such ponderous architraves could possibly have been raised to so great a height. The architraves are the columns, right?
This is the columns. He's obsessed.
So this, however, the architect effected by means of bags filled with sand. Oh, we're on the bags of sand again. This is what he said before, which he piled up upon an inclined plane until they reached beyond the capitals of the columns. Then, as he gradually emptied the lower bags, the architraves insensibly settled in the places assigned to them. But the greatest difficulty of all was found in laying the lintel which he placed over the entrance doors. It was an enormous mass of stone, and by no possibility could it be brought to lie level upon the jambs which formed its bed, in consequence of which the architect was driven to such a state of anxiety and desperation as to contemplate suicide. Wearied and quite worn out by such thoughts as these, during the night, they say, he beheld in a dream the goddess in honor of whom the temple was being erected, who exhorted him to live on, for that she herself had placed the stone in its proper position. And such, in fact, next morning was found to be the case, the stone apparently having come to the proper level by dint of its own weight. The other decorations of this work would suffice to fill many volumes, but they did not tend in any way to illustrate the works of nature.
What he's talking about here sounds like the lintel stone, which was you put the wood down and then you put the stone down that then the roof will rest on. Anyway, Pausanias tells us, quote, "But all cities worship Artemis of Ephesus, and individuals hold her in honor above all the gods. The reason, in my view, is the renown of the Amazons, who traditionally dedicated their image, also the extreme antiquity of the sanctuary. 3 other points as well have contributed to her renown. The size of the temple, surpassing all buildings among men, the eminence of the city of the Ephesians, and the renown of the goddess who dwells there." And one of the things I left out, because there's some debate as to how old the temple is that this is potentially one of the oldest temples to Artemis or some of the Greek gods. Like, I feel like it's like competing with another temple to Apollo. So it is quite ancient. And Pausanias is saying here, this is so ancient that everyone knows it and they have to give praise back.
306 BC is when it would have been built, right? So that wouldn't have been that ancient by the time.
Well, remember, 600 BC is when the original sanctuary was there. And it was even further back in history that people were worshiping a goddess there. He's definitely referring to they were worshiping here in 600, and maybe even before that there was the temple. Remember, they wouldn't have had an idea of what would have existed before you were worshiping in 600s, right? They would have assumed the goddess has always been worshipped here in this way, in this sort of place. So, this new temple was so grand that even before it was completed, legends about it had sprung up, including that the lintel itself, that the stone above the door, was placed by the goddess herself. And I wanted to include all of these quotes from the ancient writers, as in theory, they all saw the incredible structure. All of these different ancient writers were struck dumb in different ways, in theory, according to their words. Some were in awe of the size and scope and the majesty of the temple, and others, like Pliny, were fascinated in the mechanics of how such a thing had been constructed. And I really love Pliny's awe at, he's one of those people who would just sit there binge watching how did this get made. He needed all the details. And Jenny, that honestly reminds me of you all the time.
Really?
Yes. Every time I'm is Jenny going to be satisfied with these facts or is she going to want more? Whereas I'm moving on. No, Jenny wants to know.
I do. I want to be all up in the nooks and crannies. I want to dig into those little mysterious pockets and figure out what's in there. I want to go deep in the bowels of the pyramid and go down that one passage that the one cursed passage.
You want to get all up in the butt of the Sphinx, whereas I'm he's got a nice face and kind eyes. I kind of like him for who he is. And you're I need to get in there.
I feel every time you refer to anyone's kind eyes, I throw up in my mouth a little bit. I'm oh God, that's the worst quality is having kind eyes. Ew.
I'm sorry, you can have serial killer eyes. You can have crazy eyes. I don't see why you can't have also kind eyes. You can have horny eyes. Those are good too. But crazy eyes and serial killer eyes, I know them. I'm not letting you anywhere near my knickers. Moving on.
Or your nipples. Anyhow, so we're talking about what is inside the temple right now. Inside the temple, in addition to the altar, was a series of hive-like little pod rooms that were used by the priestesses and priests of the temple. There were barracks for visitors and those who came to the temple seeking sanctuary. The business of seeking sanctuary at the temple was a huge freaking deal. Sit down. Mythologically, the temple was a sacred sanctuary because the Amazons had founded it, seeking the goddess's protection from both Heracles and Dionysus, and it became known throughout the ages as a place where refuge would be given to those in need and worthy of it. It was forbidden to remove a refugee seeking sanctuary from the temple's grounds because that person was under the protection of Artemis. So I have a question about this, Jen. Is this where the tradition of sanctuary in Christian churches comes from?
Could be. I did not do a deep dive into Christian sanctuary. Like we said, we can't parse it through the sources quickly and easily, but we do know that sanctuary at a temple was given even in ancient times by non-Christian gods. Anyway, let's talk about the sanctuary business. Many famous people came to the temple when they needed to hide out from their enemies. This list includes Arsinoe,
little sister of Cleopatra,
Artemisia the First,
Not the one who married her brother.
The one who was a badass, like, warrior queen in general.
Well, they both were. They were both badass naval generals. One of them married her brother, one of them didn't.
Some of the assassins of Julius Caesar hid out here. Mithridates came here when the heat was on. And Cleopatra and Antony, they actually staged their final naval battle from here. They were here keeping themselves safe from enemies. There's a lot of people who did this, and it's really fascinating to dive into some of these famous lives and why they came here and why the legend is they came here and how that ties into the larger story of Ephesus and their own personal mythology. But let's get back to the story. This sanctuary was a place where if the goddess granted you her safety, and she didn't always grant safety, you could recoup and you could feel safe and secure while you planned your next move. That wasn't always the case, Arsinoe, but we'll get there. As I said, I'm going to do a Patreon episode on famous exiles and refugees who came through Ephesus because there were a lot and they had a lot of reasons for coming here. But let's now go back to the temple. So that is how this incredible temple functioned at its height. But this is Ancient History Fangirl's tagline: nothing good can ever stay, because the patriarchy. As time marched into the 80s, there were new emperors in Rome, including Augustus, and these emperors didn't particularly care to give the goddess as much due as she deserved. And Ephesus, at one point in time, could command a lot of respect, a lot of money, and got away with a lot of shit because of where it was located. But the city itself started to fall in standing as the times changed, as the Christians came, as more natural disasters weakened and shook their sacred temple.
And then one day, it all changed. For 600 years, the new and improved version of the temple stood, the third temple, the one that made the list of 7 wonders, a wonder itself among the ancient and now changing world. But with the arrival of a new god, one who didn't enjoy the power of the old gods so much, let's say one that didn't even tolerate those gods existing, certainly not the power of a primordial goddess who warned you to get the fuck away with her gorgons. It was only a matter of time before the temple met its final fate. There is an apocryphal tale that is supposed to tell us about the triumph of the new god over our beloved Artemis. The story goes like this. St. John was in Ephesus as the first Christian missionary. After St. John preached about the good word of Jesus for the first time, good Lord, he would not shut up, let me tell you what, the stone altar in the temple of Artemis cracked and was broken. For remember, the goddess is the one who placed the lintel. So, like, her stone cracking and breaking is like one of those full circle tragedies. This is, of course, not true. We do not believe it. If it did happen, it's probably because of earthquakes and not because of fucking St. John. But it does make for a great tale, a sad tale. I wouldn't say it's a great tale. I would say it's a colonialist tale of the new god colonizing the old gods. And I would also say it's a gender colonization story as well.
I'm not disagreeing with you. Look, it's a great story. Doesn't make it true.
I take offense at the word great.
Sure, because you're thinking of the word great as in like modifying a good thing. I'm thinking of the word great as in great and terrible.
It's a great and terrible story. I'm focusing on the terrible part.
I mean, it's just that's how big it got, right? But anyway, here's what we think actually happened. At this point in time, there was a rise in oversilting in the river, removing the silt from the bed.
Which would have made the river less accessible to people, right? So, like, people weren't coming up this riverine highway like they used to be. And potentially this would have had an effect on the biodiversity of the area as well.
All of those things, and also would have weakened, presumably maybe deepened the river in places and changed how far the temple was from the shore.
Like, changed where the river was, which would have made the temple less accessible to, like, riverine passage.
Absolutely. And maybe even less accessible on your way to trade with the city, like almost looping it out of that fundamental trade.
Right. It used to be right at the hub, and now it's a backwater, just because the river changed where it flowed.
Well, it was oversilting, so it was man actually oversilting it as well as other things happening. Men did that. This is man-made oversilting.
What was the context of that?
I don't know. I just know they were oversilting the river at this point in time. So you have the oversilting of the river, a new religion that firmly took power from women and placed it in the hands of men and didn't really respect women as anything other than mothers and conduits of birth. The belief is that Mary lived out to the end of her life peacefully in Ephesus, and there is an original chapel to Mary with potentially maybe some reliquary there. That is the story, the narrative that the Christians framed around this. And it's also a narrative which we have a virgin mother. We also have a virgin mother goddess. It's very easy to fold those two things in together and take power away from both of them in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because to men at the time who were in power, the salient thing is that Artemis and Mary were both virgins and mothers.
Yes, Artemis, we talked about it in the first and second episodes. She was able to reproduce asexually because they believed at this point in time bees reproduced asexually, so she could give life to things should she so choose.
She was a virgin mother, like Mary.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. She didn't necessarily choose to do that, but she could. They were like saying like, yes, we also have a virgin goddess who functions this way. And it's like, okay, we don't really like that, but all your feast days are our feast days. And, okay, we can get on with this, right? Because one of the things you have to remember about feast days in general is whatever religion was in charge would give you a series of feast days throughout the calendar year. Now, they were generally tied to religion. Otherwise, there wasn't a thing called the weekend. So your days off were very much tied to Saturnalia or Julius Caesar's birth or whatever the divine holidays were. And then that came into the Christian and the Catholic calendar in medieval times. There was no weekends, but there was, the 2-week festival of Christmas or whatever. So that's really important, the folding of those two things together, because that's also how the common people got their time off and all those kind of things that we really take for granted these days. So as we talked about, here's what actually happened in this area. There was oversilting of the river, a new religion that firmly took power from women and placed it in the hands of men, and a series of natural disasters and invasions. The temple lost its prominence and much of its funding. There was no whale to come and rebuild it. The temple suffered another epic earthquake in 267 AD, and later that year, it brought some of Jenny's good friends, the Goths. They came in and sacked the temple, burning and looting it.
So the temple continued to limp along, a hollow husk of its former self, until it was closed sometime in the mid-5th century AD. Much of the site was repurposed into other new buildings, and the site was lost to time, to landslides, to earthquakes. Until, in the 1860s, a railroad engineer trying to build a railroad through Ottoman Turkey wound up discovering something else instead when he tunneled into the ground. It took him 6 years, but John Turtle Wood, best name ever for a gentleman archaeologist, I suppose, it's a decent one. So anyway, he found the top of the columns of the Temple of Artemis. He never did get to build that railway, but he did bring something up from the earth and back into the world, the lost temple.
What is left of the temple doesn't remain in Ephesus. Much of it was shipped to the British Museum and other museums in Europe and even the US. What is left at the site of Ephesus, where the temple defied the sun and the clouds, are a few lone columns, some colonies of cats. Those lone columns, though, those lonely, bony fingers, stripped of their gold and adornments, point to the sky. They're holding the space between the wild world and the civilized, looking to the moon and their goddess to shine upon them once again and restore their former glory. So that's it for this week, and maybe this series.
I think this is it for the series. Yeah, that we've covered it all. We've covered all of the 7 wonders on the list. It took us a lot longer than I thought it would, to be honest. I really thought this would be done by now.
Yeah, we'll be back next week with a new episode, a seasonal one. I'm hard at work on it.
Actually, maybe in 2 weeks with a seasonal episode. And in the meantime, we may have a book club interview. I don't know. We don't know what's happening in this podcast.
Thank you all so much for sticking with us, for getting through this series, which has been both fascinating and heartbreaking in a lot of ways. If you want to say hello to us and interact with us, we are on social media. We are on mostly Threads and Instagram at Ancient History Fangirl. I'm experimenting with TikTok at Ancient History Fangirl. We also have a page on Facebook.
She's tried to drag me into TikTok. I've been resisting. I realize the algorithm gets you a lot of views, but I'm just too perfectionist for videos. I've tried. I do it on the Patreon. So if you want to see videos of me and Jen, get on the Patreon. Patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl.
We still have an account on X. We really only use it for updates if we update it all. We tend to be more active on Instagram, Threads, on Facebook, on TikTok occasionally, and also on our Patreon. And speaking of Jenny, we have some patrons to thank. Our Patreon is literally the reason we can keep doing this podcast. Without them, we don't make enough money via ads or anything else to sustain us. So we are so grateful to each and every one of our patrons, particularly during this festive season.
We have some Patreon members to thank this week. And if you would like to join our Patreon, it is at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. We do extra episodes. We do video episodes. We do all kinds of fun things. We have some patrons to thank, and apologies if we mispronounce anyone's name. I've had a few glasses of wine at this point, you could probably tell. Thank you so much to Laura Muchensky,
Leola, just Leola, with the sunshiny smile face.
Nancy Pasquariello,
Twanny Craig,
3 Julius Githerizer.
I think it's Julius Geezer, but the 3s are meant to be the vowels. But anyway.
It's cute. I like it.
And Liamo, just Liamo.
All caps, making a statement. Thank you all so much for your support. We really appreciate it. We could not do this podcast without you. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you next week.
Love books.
Curious about the publishing industry? Us too.
I'm Jeff O'Neill.
I'm Rebecca Shinsky, and we host the Book Riot podcast.
Every week we talk about what's new in the world of books and reading.
Trends, breaking news, book awards, bestsellers, scandals, you name it.
If you care about what people are reading and how the book world really works,
subscribe to the Book Riot podcast wherever you get your podcasts.